Okay, hello everybody. All right, so here is our Ishrat hat so far. We have got our garter stitch band here on it, which is knit. Then we had a row of traditional crochet to transition between the knitting and the Tunisian crochet here. And now we've got all 5 of our panels done and we just have left the seam to do. So you can see the top there on it. It is already quite a nice little starfish type shape. You can see the legs coming off the star there on the top for the crown. And when we seam the whole thing up, it will become decidedly hat shaped like so. So what we need to do here is to find the strand of yarn that we ended our last piece of Tunisian crochet with, which was this one here. And what I did at the end of that was simply to do a row of slip stitches down the edge of my work here, and then to bind off, sew down so that my yarn was in the right location for when I wanted to begin sewing up my seam. Now I've attached an extra piece of yarn on this here for this particular one, so if you're wondering what this is about, that's just me fudging this whole thing to look right. And I've sewn in all my other ends so we don't get confused with any of them. I have given myself about a meter's worth or so of seaming yarn, single-stranded. You definitely will not need any more than this. Could probably do a little bit less, but I like about a meter or so, about an arm's worth, an arm span. Okay, so here we go. What we have here is we're starting off on the knit band. So we're going to do a kind of a mattress stitch here on this to begin with. And then we're going to go to the most invisible seam that I can find for the edge of Tunisian work to finish off the rest of the hat here on this. So with your yarn on the piece of fabric furthest away from you, what I'd like you to do is to put your index finger between the two. This is a trick my mum showed me. It means that you can see exactly what you're doing on both sides and you have full control over everything that you're working on here. So with the yarn at the back of the work here, what I'm going to do is examine the front and just put my needle from the inside. You're always working from your finger out on either side, by the way. You're always punching outwards. So here we go. So I'm going to pop my needle into the very edge, nothing in particular other than just the edge there to make sure we have a nice sharp corner. And then I'm going to find the last V that was created on my cast off. And I'm again from the middle outwards, I'm going to sew through that. So I'm essentially making a figure of 8 shape. You can kind of see it there. There's your figure of 8 shape. And you're going to be doing this infinity symbol the whole way through. I'm sure there's another name for it, but I just call it the infinity stitch for that very reason. At this point along, it is simply a matter of looking at the band closest to you, which is your cast on side of matters, and finding the closest little bobbly bit to your work. This will ensure that you get a nice invisible seam without any extra kind of cast on, cast off rows to worry about. So once again, you're going from the center out and pulling. And then you find the next V on your cast off row. And again, from the center out, you're pulling. Pull that nice and tight. Find the next upward bobbly bit right there. Repeat the process. It's kind of like lacing a shoe, really. You're going from the inside out the whole time. Every couple of stitches, give it a bit of a tug, make sure everything stays nice and neat. And continue persisting doing that the whole way up the knit section of your hat. Just like so. Really, this seam works for any sewing into any particular part of this, because it's a nicely baffling piece of work. It's not too smooth. It's not going to seem like a huge stitch worked over stuff. And kind of, if you're wondering what the noise in the background is, by the way, that is Cora rooting around in a beanbag trying to figure out what that smell is. There you go. I spilled coffee on it earlier. I think she's figured that out. Okay, here we go. So we're coming close to the end here on this. And you can kind of see the stitches themselves. There is a very, very slight boop to them right there. The thing is that each of the bobbles kind of match up nicely on it regardless, so I quite like it as a stitch. Here we go, in there. The beauty of this as well, of course, is that because you've got diagonal stitches and there's some work working around itself, it's also a nice stretchy band. So you don't end up with a tight piece of your fabric on something that's otherwise stretchy. I think there's nothing sadder than a beautiful piece of knitting or crochet that simply has got no give in it whatsoever and just ends up with this mean seam as a result of it. I think your whole entire garment, whatever it is, accessory or clothing, should flow nicely as an item. So I think this seam does that quite nicely. It gives you a nice similar stretch to what you had on your knitting. So that's your knitting section done, and it's lovely and smooth. On the inside, you'll get a very slight ridge from the bit of the fabric that you didn't use, but all that does is just to show you which bit goes at the back of your head. There we go. So that's that seam, nice and done, and it's lovely and smooth along the edge as well, as you can see there. So there you go. Okay, so now we're on to the Tunisian part, and I tend to work this direction like so with my hand on the inside when I'm working the Tunisian section, because it's actually, I'm going to be stitching back and forth, but I need to pay attention to the lines on either side of my work here as I go. Now, first things first, we need a little bit of housekeeping. So what I do is I stitch just 1 or 2 stitches up the edge, nice and tight, so that when I do start into my Tunisian work, it actually smooths out nicely on that. I'm going to hide in my work here. Otherwise, that stitch will just be a big long stitch coming up to this piece that I will eventually work into. So I'm just threading up through my work a little bit, like so, just to hide everything nice and neatly, so I'm in the right spot. Okay, so now when it comes to your Tunisian seam, all you're really needing to do is to work from the bottom of the line up, like so. So you're going from underneath it, picking it up, and then finding the corresponding one on the other side and doing the same. So it's just from bottom to top. Simple as that. Find the next one along, bottom, top, and seaming. And that sits everything in place nicely like that. Do the next one, this big pink one here. Go bottom, top, like so. And this is essentially the simplest of seams. You're creating a strand of yarn that works up. You can see it there. I'm pulling it tight. You can see it on that piece there. All it's doing is it's ensuring that the lines on either side correspond in the right direction. You want to make sure that the left side of a line is underneath the right side of the next one along. And all this seam here is doing is ensuring that that very slight diagonal you get is preserved throughout the whole thing. So it helps hide the seam a little bit throughout the piece. Bottom, top, like so. And luckily we've got enough vertical lines within the columns themselves that the yarn, if it is seen, would just be mistaken for a piece of the fabric, because it is a consistent theme throughout. There you go, bottom, top, like so. You still see that there? Is it okay on the camera? Yeah. Go in there. We go in there like so. To the next one here. Next one here. And of course, the beauty of this as well is that I use very little yarn, unlike the infinity stitch or mattress stitch down there, which uses quite a lot. This is definitely not yarn heavy, but bear in mind, because yarn doesn't have a lot of stretch, your best bet is always to give it a bit of a squiggle every now and then, give it a bit of a stretch to ensure that you don't end up with that mean tight seam that we all hate so much. There you go, okay. There we go. Next one along here. Next one along. There it is. There it is. Lovely stuff. If you ever get lost on this, your best bet is always to kind of step back a little bit and have a look at the lay of the land to see where your lines are. If you can't figure out which loop is the next, go back and have a look around along your fabric itself. But look how beautiful that seam is. Look how that's practically invisible. That's lovely. I love this particular seam. There we go. So things are going to be like this up to the point where, if you remember, the very first column of a panel has got more stitches in it, or more loops collected than the last panel. So we've got ourselves a bit of an offset, a bit of a conundrum to come to. And how we're going to solve that is simply by using the V's on top of your panel, which will slot quite nicely and should be accurately mathematically done. With the next one along. So you're just going line by line until you run out of lines, which we are about to at this point here. You still got more on that side. So what we're going to do then is to find an alternative in the diagonal on top of the last panel you created. Okay, we've got our last line here. And the last line here. Right, okay, so that is beautiful so far. Give that a bit of a stretch to ensure there's a nice bit of give to it. When that blocks, that'll block lovely and flat, like so. And again, you have a very, very, very slight ridge. There you can see the V's on it there on that side. Very slight ridge on that side of our work. And at this point, all we have is this little hole left here, which you could probably leave open for a ponytail if you fancied it. But at this point, what we need to do is to start using the V's on the top of the diagonal here. You can see them along the top there with the remaining lines that we have on this side. So we will pop into our first V and then pick up our line from underneath. Pop into our next V and pick up a line underneath. Comes that. Next V and a line underneath. Remember to give it a tug. You don't want it to get too mean on you. Really, the key to a good seam is figuring out the best way to hold it for yourself. So if what I'm doing doesn't seem like it works for you, then by all means hold it a different way. I find if I can at all, putting my hand on the inside tends to help. But right now I am trying to make sure this is easier for you guys to see. So I'm trying to keep it dark behind there. Here we go. I'm going to pick up this guy here. That's a lovely seam in and of itself. You know, it's very, very smooth. And it will, because there's very little to the seam itself, and it is quite a sturdy one, it will blend in reasonably well with the other ones. So, I mean, if you have an eye to it, you'll see the difference. But if you're not looking, you won't notice, you know. What they say, a man on a galloping horse wouldn't notice, isn't that it? I love that phrase. There we go. Okay, and our last one here, we've got one last V. Pop that into the edge there. Give that one last stretch to be sure. And then all you have at the end is that little hole at the top. Now for this, before I stitch around and pull it tight, I tend to do 1 or 2 stitches back in the last spot where I was, just to secure that, because the last thing you want is to pull this tight and then have the seam down here pull tight as well on you and have, again, a bit of a bunching section. So if you stitch a couple of times in there to begin with, that means that at least there's a stopper put on that. And when you do pull around and drawstring that tight, the drawstring isn't going to add tension down here at all. So into our little hole on top, which you can absolutely leave if you want as well, by the way, or stick a bobble on top. What I do is I simply, for each segment, I thread my needle from the inside to the outside, almost like it's a drawstring bag. 2, 3, that's number 4. And back to where I started, number 5. Pop my needle through, because we're going to need that in there in a minute. And from the inside, I can find my thread again. Where's it gone? There it is. Okay, so from the inside, all you have to do is pull, and that tightens that up nice and solid. And there's the top of your hat. Isn't that so pretty? There we go. So now we have got that pulled tight, but it isn't being held together with anything. So if we turn it inside out and have a look on the inside, have to find a tug there. And simply stitch it a couple of times on the inside to secure it. Doesn't have to be anywhere in particular. Just make sure you don't sew through to the outside too much, because you don't want those stitches to be visible. So just find somewhere decent to anchor everything. If you're lucky, you'll find the few stitches you did before you started into the drawstring, and you can sew into those and then thread around a little bit. You're always best adding an extra little bit of stitching on the inside, so that if stuff does start to unravel, at least you've given yourself a little bit of a lifeboat, so you've got something to thread onto a needle to repair it. It's always best to assume it'll unravel rather than hope it won't, is my philosophy on that. So I always feed a decent length of a tail, at least a needle's worth, on the inside of a piece like this, to ensure that if everything does start to unravel, at least I can unpick that, and that's something to put on my needle to restitch everything up. So once you have added a bit of a lifeboat for yourself, chop your yarn, flip it inside out, and there you go. There's your Ishrat hat. Smooth as can be. Now, if you are looking to block it, your best bet really, as far as I'm concerned, is to wet it and stick it on your head until it's dry. But if that does not appeal to you, what you can do is to make sure it makes that sort of a shape. That's my seam in the middle here. I fold number 1 and then fold number 2 over like so, and just let that dry in that shape. And then that is a good slouch to have at the back of your head, like so. So I hope you do give it a go, and if you do, let me know in the comments below. Go and have a look at Fruitful Fusion's yarn as well. Please do. Her yarn's absolutely beautiful, and feel free to pop by my Patreon, by my website, yarntowers.com as well, and visit my Etsy shop. All the links are in the description, and I will see you again soon. Thanks a million for watching.